Most Americans know that something is drastically wrong with our nation. Polls taken during the last election showed that more than two-thirds of those polled believe the United States is headed in the wrong direction. Each day there is new evidence of this. U.S. industry is collapsing, with major layoffs announced virtually every day, as the corporate raiders and takeover specialists of the 1980s make their profits from asset-stripping firms. The U.S. has become the world's largest debtor nation, with a total public and private debt of more than $20 trillion. Despite the phony statistics put out by Washington, drug use continues to grow among children and teens, while drug traffickers take in hundreds of billions of dollars each year. The so-called entertainment industry fills the public airways with hour after hour of mindless filth, while today's Hollywood movies contain little but sex, violence, and vulgar language. What has happened to our country? Some of you blame the Congress, others the occupant in the White House, while still others blame special interests. There is one so-called special interest group which is at the center of much of the corruption that is rotting our nation's moral fiber, a group that is not very well known. That group goes by the name of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. Very few people will name the ADL as a dangerous, corrupting influence out of fear of being labeled anti-Semitic by the ADL. But you will discover during the next hour that despite its claim to be a defender of Jews from anti-Semitism, in reality, the ADL has dedicated itself to undermining the United States. It is an organization which has promoted racism from its parent organization's support for the Confederacy in the 1800s to its defense of the founder of the Ku Klux Klan today. It is a defender of organized crime, with leaders who have profited from their involvement in laundering money from bootlegging whiskey during the Prohibition era to drug money today. And it has been at the center of the illegal and immoral financial operations which looted the United States during the 1980s. If you wish to act to save the United States from plunging further into a new dark age, you must first learn the ugly truth about the Anti-Defamation League.
There's a fascinating political development which occurred in recent weeks that very, very few people know about. This had to do with a campaign that was launched back in September 1992 by Lyndon LaRouche and his associates. It was a campaign led by Reverend James Bevel, who had previously been the direct action coordinator of Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And Bevel became the vice presidential candidate running with Lyndon LaRouche in the 1992 presidential election. And LaRouche and Bevel launched a campaign to take down a symbol of oppression that is standing in Judiciary Square in Washington, D.C. To take it down as a symbolic gesture in the same way that the freedom fighters and pro-democratic forces throughout Eastern Europe and Russia tore down every statue of the hated tyrants, Stalin, Lenin, Dzerzhinsky, and others. The statue in Washington, D.C. is a statue of a man named Albert Pike. He's not very well known to most Americans. In fact, very few people who would see his statue as you stumbled upon it, perhaps coming out of the Department of Labor building in Washington or the Washington, D.C. City Council chambers, which now overlook it, you might wonder who this man is, the so-called poet, this jurist, this man who is a very huge man. You can tell that from the statue. A man named Albert Pike. Well, Albert Pike was the head of the organization called the Scottish Rite Freemasons during the time around the U.S. Civil War. And Pike, after the Civil War, was a founding member of an organization known as the Ku Klux Klan. And Pike, who was honored in Washington, D.C. with a statue, was a Confederate general who was so repulsive that even the Confederacy eventually had to kick him out and bring him up on charges. Pike was a war criminal. He had to leave Arkansas, which had become his home in the mid-1830s, because of his role during the Civil War in organizing bands of Indians to go and scalp civilians as far north as Minnesota. And so it should be somewhat surprising to people to find out that a man of this sort, a man who was involved at the center of the conspiracy to break apart the Union of the United States, a man who, after the Civil War, did everything he could to destroy the Reconstruction period, including going as far as organizing the Ku Klux Klan. Why is there a statue to this man in downtown Washington, D.C.? And so, being public-spirited, the Associates of LaRouche said, let's tear this thing down. And we started organizing to do it. And it became more and more popular movement. We got leaflets out all over the city. Before long, city councils such as Newark, New Jersey, Austin, Texas, New Orleans, Birmingham, Buffalo, and several others endorsed resolutions to pull down the statue. And a number of the city councilmen in Washington, D.C. signed a resolution also to tear down this statue. And people such as the film director Spike Lee and former mayor of Washington, D.C. Marion Barry and comedian activist Dick Gregory were among the hundreds of people who added their names to the petition to tear down the statue of Albert Pike. Well, that campaign really began in late summer and was pushed forward in September 1992. And yet here we are at the end of January 1993. The statue is not only still there, but is being defended by the Parks Department and the Washington, D.C. City Police and several other government bureaus. Now, why is that? What happened to the resolution? Well, this is where you'll find something very fascinating, especially those of you who are not too familiar with the workings of the organization, the Scottish Rite Freemasons, or an organization that was spun off that in the latter part of the 19th century and actually became a full organization in about 1913, something called the Anti-Defamation League. These organizations are the only two organizations that have defended the statue. The Scottish Rite Freemasons, which is supposedly a benevolent order of people who meet to do good, and the Anti-Defamation League, which supposedly is an organization to protect Jewish Americans from anti-Semitism. Now you might wonder, why would an organization supposedly set up to defend Jews from anti-Semitism, that in fact has a tax-exempt status for its work to expose anti-Semites, why would they be supporting the continued presence of a statue of the founder of the Ku Klux Klan in Washington, D.C.? And what we're going to be investigating in the next hour is the answer to that seemingly puzzling question. And what you will learn is the ugly truth of the Anti-Defamation League. The issue of Pike is a perfect place to start in looking at this. Pike was part of what is best known, is most accurately known, as a British conspiracy against the American Union. The United States, as I think our history departments still teach enough history so that we know the United States was created as a revolt against Great Britain. Although if you watch Americans get all excited whenever those degenerates from Britain, the royal family, come over here, you'd think some people wish they were still the king and queen of the United States. Well, we made a revolution against Britain, and the British didn't give up. they launched the War of 1812 after a series of provocations to bring the United States back into Britain. They continued through the 1830s, backing such characters as Andrew Jackson, who was a traitor to the United States, who set out to destroy the economy of this country by opposing the Bank of the United States, which had been set up by Alexander Hamilton, precisely to enable the United States to become independent from British bankers and financial interests. From the 1830s up to the time of the Civil War, the British continued to mobilize, coordinating a whole network of people, individuals such as Albert Pike, who went to Arkansas, Slidell in Louisiana, several other people, Caleb Cushing, a number of people who were involved in this, Judah Benjamin, who we'll find out, a very important person in this conspiracy. And eventually they engineered what should be known, rather than the Civil War or the war between the states, as the Great Slave Owners' Revolt, which began after the election of President Abraham Lincoln. Now, very active on behalf of this group working for the British monarchy, for the Freemasons in London, was a group of people who were organized under a Freemasonic type organization called B'nai B'rith. Now, it should be pointed out that most American Jews during the time of the Civil War supported the Union, supported Lincoln, and were very prominent in their involvement on behalf of the American Union. However, there was a small group of people who formed a fifth column, who worked directly with Albert Pike and the Scottish Rite Freemasons. And one of those is a man named Judah Benjamin. Judah Benjamin, who came out of Charleston, South Carolina, which was a center of this B'nai B'rith crowd that worked on behalf of British slave-owning interests and supported the Confederacy against the Union during the Civil War. Judah Benjamin, during that war, served as the Attorney General for the Confederacy. He was also Secretary of War and Secretary of State. While he was Attorney General, he worked to both sponsor and defend an organization known as the Knights of the Golden Circle. The Knights of the Golden Circle is the predecessor to the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And its purpose was to run operations into the North against the Union and to defend the South during the period of war. Now, Judah Benjamin was, after the war, he fled to England, not surprisingly, and he made a series of quotes. I want to read you a couple things he said about the Confederacy to make it clear that we're talking about someone who was totally committed, not simply to breaking up the United States, but to imposing the same racist policy that was implicit in the slavery that the Civil War was fought to abolish. These are quotes from Judah Benjamin. I have always looked with the utmost dread and distrust on the experiment of emancipation so suddenly enforced on the South by the event of the war. God knows how it will all end. The South, he said, after 1866, is kept crushed under Negro rule. At another time, he said, I can never consent to go to New Orleans and break my heart witnessing the rule of Negroes and carpetbaggers. And he said at another point, nothing is so abhorrent to me as radicalism, which seeks to elevate the populace into the governing class. Judah Benjamin, racist, Confederate, and agent of the British Empire, and member of B'nai B'rith, and protector of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, he's not the only person who was involved in this operation, this B'nai B'rith crowd working on behalf of the Confederacy. Benjamin, by the way, was charged with sedition for his role in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, because the Knights of the Golden Circle was the agency which committed and sponsored and ran the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The lawyer for B'nai B'rith at this point in time, during the Civil War, in Washington, D.C., was a man named Simon Wolfe, the lawyer for the Anti-Defamation League, and he later became, or I'm sorry, for the B'nai B'rith, and he later became the president of B'nai B'rith nationally. In 1862, he was arrested and charged with spying on behalf of the South. He was running a ring of spies within Washington, D.C. against Lincoln. He also, totally coincidentally, of course, was a friend of John Wilkes Booth, the man who was at least involved in the assassination of Lincoln and who was allowed to escape through his networks in the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, this network of the Knights of the Golden Circle, it was out of this group that the Ku Klux Klan was formed after the Civil War. And it was this group which Albert Pike was the national coordinator. And it was this group that, under the guise of fighting against the Negroes and the carpetbaggers, it was this group that worked with British interests and with Freemasonic interests after Lincoln's assassination to destroy the program of Reconstruction which intended to build up the South after the Civil War. Now, this is a bit of American history that very few people know. It's there in the history books. But we discovered an interesting thing when we started looking back at Pike. If you look at the history books that were written at the turn of the century and through the 1920s and 1930s, you find that many of them are very favorable in their coverage of the Ku Klux Klan. They say that the Klan was really a bunch of upstanding citizens, white citizens, who were trying to protect the South from this alien rule in the North. And as Judah Benjamin said, we're trying to enforce, uplift the populace to be part of the government. You know, it's the aristocrat's nightmare. But the Klan, the Night Riders, with their flowing robes, is viewed as heroic by the historians of the early part of the 20th century. And we've recently done some research, which was published in a New Federalist article, of a movie that was made at the beginnings of Hollywood by D.W. Griffith, who was one of the first of the great so-called directors. And it was originally called The Klansman, and its name was changed to The Birth of the Nation. But it's a movie which glorifies the Klan. Now, in these books, talking about how great the Klan is, they mention Albert Pike as a heroic figure, and they say Pike, one of the founders of the Klan, Pike, the chief jurist for the Klan. So in the history written by people, many of whom, by the way, were members of the Klan, in their own history, they talk about Pike's role and they defend Pike. So why is it that when Reverend Bevel led the charge with LaRouche's organization to bring down the statue of Albert Pike, that the ADL defended the founder of the Ku Klux Klan? This ADL, this civil rights organization, is out there defending a man who inspired lynching and murder on a large scale. Now, granted, if you've ever seen a picture of Pike, and he's one of these very huge figures, an Arkansas newspaper recently made a joke about it. It said that Pike couldn't have been in the Klan. There weren't any horses big enough for him to ride on. And they wrote about how he would have been an imposing figure with his robes flowing. It would have looked like a mountain moving towards you. It would have inspired fear in anyone. But the Anti-Defamation League went into the office of Councilman Lightfoot, who introduced the resolution to pull down the statue. And they said to him, "You must withdraw the resolution. We cannot allow Lyndon LaRouche to get credit for pulling down this statue." And Lightfoot told them to get lost, and they came back again, and they said, "We have evidence to prove that Pike is not part of the Klan. It had nothing to do with the Klan." To which Lightfoot correctly said, "Why don't we do this? You bring your evidence, and we'll let historian Anton Chaikin bring his evidence, and we'll have a public hearing, and then we'll let the council decide. And the ADL instead has been working behind the scenes to take away from Lightfoot his chairmanship of a committee of the Washington, D.C. City Council, and to give him threats that he may soon lose his position altogether. So when we're talking about this question of the Civil War and talking about the Confederacy and the issue of Pike, this is not something which is dead. This is also why it's important that this statue must come down, because what it symbolizes still exists among us today, the kind of bigotry and hatred and corruption which typified the Confederacy as an agent of the British trying to destroy this noble experiment of the United States. That same sentiment exists today among people in the Anti-Defamation League. And not surprisingly, these people are the enemies of Lyndon LaRouche. Now, let's take a look. Let's follow this a little bit further. This is one side of the ADL. This whole tradition of treason, backing the Confederacy, backing the racists of the Ku Klux Klan, trying to keep the old system of slavery going in the South, and so on. Now, what does the Pike case tell us? Think about this. The KKK, as I said earlier, is known not simply as anti-black, but also anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic. The ADL defends the Klan. So that's one side of the ADL, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Let's take a look at another side of the ADL. Another side which is being written out of the history books even now. In 1985, the Anti-Defamation League gave its major award, what they call the Torch of Liberty. They gave it to a man named Morris Dalitz. Morris Mo Dalitz, a collaborator of Meyer Lansky, the chairman of organized crime during Prohibition, the chairman of the board, as they called him. Now, why is it that an organization, again, supposedly devoted to Jewish civil rights and honesty and goodness, how would they give their top award to a man who made his fortune during Prohibition running illegal booze, later on moving into Las Vegas, setting up the casinos? What were the casinos, by the way? They're laundering money. That's what casinos serve as an opportunity to do. Making money with Lansky in Cuba. He was one of Lansky's partners in his Cuba operation. So why is it that the Anti-Defamation League would come out and give an award to a man known as nothing but an organized crime punk? Well, this goes back again to a long history. We go back to 1908, when there was a serious problem in New York City. There was a crime problem. Many of the sections of New York City had immigrant populations. And feeding off the honest immigrants arose gangs of thugs. Now, we know this today in the popular culture. If you ever see the movie The Godfather, and you see Don Corleone as originally a man from the Italian community who couldn't make his way until he figured out how to use an olive oil company as a front for an organized crime operation. And that, in fact, is something that did happen. That's where Lucky Luciano comes from the Italian side of the organized crime networks. Now, to say that, to make a movie about that, to write books about it, is not to say that every single Italian Catholic was a gangster. Now, at the same time that was being done in the Italian community, the same thing was being done in the Jewish community. And it was in that community that young punks like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who's now a hero in Hollywood movies, the immoral character Warren Beatty is playing Bugsy Siegel and trying to make him seem like an interesting, good guy. Well, these characters are running around, running prostitution operations, running numbers operations, insurance, protection racket, and so on. And the New York City Police Commissioner started to crack down on this. In 1908, Theodore Bingham, who was the police commissioner, launched an investigation into these crime networks. Now, he did it in part because people in the Italian community, in the Irish community, and in the Jewish community were going to the police asking for protection from these thugs. Well, a funny thing happened. There's an organization called the Publicity Committee of B'nai B'rith. And they sent out people and did an investigation, a supposed investigation, into this problem of crime. And they said that this is nothing but an attack on Jews, that Bingham is smearing the Jewish people. And eventually, before Bingham's committee could ever do its work and bring people to trial, Bingham was ousted as New York City Police Commissioner. A victory for the Publicity Committee of B'nai B'rith, which sometime during 1913 took the name the Anti-Defamation League. That is, they were moving against the defamation of Jews. And in this case, they were formed to protect the organized crime networks in New York City that happened to be Jewish networks. And that's the beginning, in its modern form, of the Anti-Defamation League. Now, after Bingham was ousted, the racketeers took over the networks, took over the ghettos. You couldn't do anything. If you owned a business on the Lower East Side, you had to pay insurance to this crowd. If you owned it in Little Italy, you had to pay insurance to Luciano. Now, while these guys were running the street operations, and they were mostly small thugs, small-time thugs. If you read the histories of this, that is, there's an old history. It's a good one. Book on Meyer Lansky by a man named Hank Messick. And this one actually goes through what a psychotic thug this guy was. When I tell you that they're rewriting the history, go pick up a book now by a guy named Lacey called Little Man, which is a new biography of Lansky. You know what it says? It says, Lansky was misunderstood. He really was just trying to make sure that the Jews could protect themselves and get a little bit for themselves. And he says, and Lansky never really had lots of money. Why, he died a poor man. It's a 350-page apology for Meyer Lansky. And that is, it was a bestseller last year. And so this is what was being done. But these were the street-level thugs. There was a higher level at the top. And one of the characters involved in that was a man named Arnold Rothstein. Now this guy knew Winston Churchill. He knew the top-level society people. He came from a family that was what was called the Our Crowd bankers. Our crowd is not a term that was given to them from the outside. It was what the German Jewish banking families, like the Lehman Brothers and Kuhn Loeb and others, called themselves, to distinguish themselves from those out there. In fact, it was the German Jewish families that discriminated against the Russian Jewish family. And one of their members was Arnold Rothstein. Now, when Prohibition came in 1920, it was Rothstein who got the contract to pick up British booze and bring it into the United States. He had a whole series of contacts. He was the one who brought Lansky and Luciano together, according to many of the stories. He worked with the Detroit gang, which became known as the Purple Gang. And there's a member of the Purple Gang today who's extremely prominent in the Republican Party named Max Fisher. We'll get more about him later, I hope. Sam Bronfman in Canada, whose family, the Bronfmans, such as Edgar Bronfman, who's the current head of the World Jewish Congress, made a huge fortune from bootlegging, eventually took over Seagram's, eventually went into all sorts of other operations, including banking and insurance. This was the network of Arnold Rothstein. Now there were other families involved in this, other nationalities. Joseph P. Kennedy was one of the bootleggers as well, the father of President John Kennedy. Well, Rothstein was killed in 1926. He was supposedly killed in a poker match. He was a colorful character. He's the one who fixed the 1919 World Series and created the Chicago Black Sox. But when he was killed, he was more or less replaced by Meyer Lansky. Lansky had a quality which set him apart. That is, there were a lot of people who were stealing money, making money illegally, and they'd spend it all. Or they do stupid things, like Bugsy Siegel. The reason he was called Bugsy was because they knew he was crazy. They said he was wild as a crazy rabbit. That's where the name Bugsy came from. But Lansky figured that what good is this money if we can't use it for something? We ought to figure out how to clean it, launder it, that is, and then invest it. And this is where Lansky made his name. He had with him a man named Frank Erickson. Erickson was a money laundering specialist. Lansky put him in charge in 1926, put Erickson in charge of a nationwide bookmaking operation. And they figured out how to launder money, how to take over small businesses. And they decided to form a bank. And in 1929, with Lansky's organized crime money, Frank Erickson became the founder of something called Sterling National Bank. Now, this bank quickly became the central bank for the garment district, which was run by the strong-armed thugs of Lansky. Anybody who wanted to do business in New York's garment district, who needed to borrow money, would go to Sterling Bank, where they'd get short-term, high-interest loans. The classic kind of quick-buck operations of loan shark and so on, only it was in a bank. And if you didn't pay, you had to deal with Lansky's thugs, who thought nothing of trashing clothing companies or breaking legs or things of that sort. This is how Sterling National Bank built itself up. Now, eventually, Frank Erickson was replaced by someone who could speak English without saying these guys and those guys and things like that. They wanted to clean up their act. And they brought in a man named Theodore Silbert. And Silbert, eventually, within a decade, I think around 1937 or 38, he became the chairman of Sterling National Bank. He also, later on in his life, became the national chairman of the Anti-Defamation League and the treasurer of the ADL. And it was Sterling Bank that became the bank of the ADL. That's where their money is. That's where their people that's the sole place where they put their money. Now, is it a coincidence? Is this something, is a Lansky connection to Sterling Bank? Is this just one guy, Erickson, a freelancer who went out and did things? Well, the evidence shows that that's not the case. There's another very prominent member of the board of Sterling Bank named Maxwell Rabb, who had been a business partner of Lansky in something called the Airport Hotel Corporation. So and Rabb also is a top-level operative for the Anti-Defamation League. Sterling Bank has been caught several times in illegal operations. In 1982, it was charged with constructive trust, conspiracy to defraud, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Now, what was this case about? This was the case of the Italian financier Michele Sindona. And Sindona was working with the Italian Freemasons, drug pushers, left and right-wing terrorists, laundering money, running dirty operations, not just in Italy but in the United States. And Sterling Bank was the laundry through which the money was coming. About $27 million, in fact, came from Italy, was laundered through Sterling, laundered back through something called Franklin National Bank, which eventually collapsed. And at the center of this operation, which includes drugs, terrorism, and organized crime, is the national chairman of the Anti-Defamation League, Theodore Silbert. And it's the bank where the ADL keeps its money. Now, this is why it's not such a surprise that the Torch of Liberty Award was given in 1985 to an organized crime partner of Lansky, that is, Mo Dalis. Now, this tradition, some people would say, well, look, you're talking about the Mustache Pete's and the shotguns and the strong-arm guys back in the 30s and the 40s and 50s. They had the bank somewhere. You can't say the whole ADL is typified by that. What evidence do you have in the present period? Well, this is where the LaRouche question comes in. In 1978, Lyndon LaRouche commissioned the research to be done to produce a book on drugs. And that book was produced. It's called Dope Incorporated. And in this book, in great painstaking detail, researchers with the Executive Intelligence Review identify how the international drug trade is able to function, how it can take hundreds of billions of dollars out of the pockets of children on street corners who are getting the drugs, how it launders that, takes it offshore to the so-called offshore banks, launders it, mixes it in with good money, brings it back to this country where it's used to buy casinos, real estate, and so on. Most of Lansky's fortune went into real estate. So the question is, once this was done, what happened to that fortune? As we already identified, our good friend, the fraudulent historian Lacey, says that poor Meyer Lansky died a penniless guy, just left a few dollars to his children. Well, they set up a trust. They learned something from the Venetians. They learned that the family may not survive, but the fondi, the family funds, can survive and continue to exert influence. And they decided we have to go into something bigger. Let's look for some bigger operation. Why buy just casinos? Why not figure out how to take over the country? Use this money to have political power, protection, and so on. Now, the key man involved in this, the most important individual in setting this up, is a man named Kenneth Bialkin. Kenneth Bialkin served as ADL National Chairman from 1982 to 1986 and is still on the board of directors of the ADL. Bialkin, in 1970, excuse me, served as a business partner with a man named Robert Vesco. Vesco was a petty crook who got in with Bialkin and figured out a way that he can take at least $250 million, or much more possibly, if he could take over a company called Investors Overseas Services. And so with Bialkin's help, Vesco took over this company, siphoned $270 million out of it, which crashed it. It was a mutual fund operation. It crashed. Vesco escaped with the money. He spent a bit of time in, I think it was Honduras or Costa Rica. And now Robert Vesco, who's wanted for looting the company, plus, by the way, campaign fraud. He gave $250,000 to Richard Nixon illegally in 1972. Vesco is now living in the workers' paradise of Cuba, where he continued to be involved with the Medellin cartel drug trafficking operation, whose godfather was Fidel Castro. Now, Bialkin was with Vesco every step of the way. In fact, in 1980, in a case brought against the bank that handled the funds, federal judge Stewart ordered Bialkin's law firm, one of the most important Wall Street law firms, Wilkie Farr Gallagher, to pay $24.5 million to the investors in iOS. And the Bank of New York had to pay $35.6 million to pay people back for the theft that was done by Bialkin. They couldn't touch Vesco. There are all kinds of indictment orders and warrants against him. But Bialkin, who was above prosecution, was hit with a slap on the wrist and had to pay fines. In fact, his law firm paid the fine. Now, in 1988, Bialkin left Wilkie Farr Gallagher and went to the law firm Skadden Arps. Let me just give you a little bit more of Bialkin's history before I show you the significance of this man, Bialkin. One of his partners at Wilkie Farr Gallagher was a man named Willard Zucker. Willard Zucker is the man who handled money for Oliver North and Richard Secord at a company called Lake Resources. And it was Zucker who worked with Bialkin in iOS. Now think about this. The iOS operation, which was a bunch of seed money that was taken from investors. That is, they had people invest in a mutual fund. They stole the money from the mutual fund, and used that money to set up a drug operation that eventually became the Medellin cartel, laundering drug money into the United States. And one of the partners did what? He was the guy who handled the money for Ollie North and Richard Secord in Iran-Contra, which was nothing but a drug and gun operation for the drug-pushing Contras. And Ollie North was protected in this by Kenneth B. Alkin at the top. One of B. Alkin's associates at Wilkie Farr Gallagher is a man named Arthur Lyman. Now, you may remember Arthur Lyman. Arthur Lyman was the attorney for the Iran-Contra Congressional Committee who covered up the real drug-running and gun-running operations that were part of Iran-Contra. And Arthur Lyman, by the way, later on became the lawyer for Michael Milken, who we'll get to in just a moment. Now, there was another man from the ADL who showed up prominently in this Ollie North operation. Now, again, very few people know this. That's why you have to get our book. You have to read this book, because people need to know what it is that's been corrupting this country going back to the time of the Civil War and before. The man named Carl Gershman, who served on the fact-finding division of the Anti-Defamation League. Gershman later became the head of something called the National Endowment for Democracy. And if you look on Ollie North's chart of the chain of command for the Iran-Contra operation, you find the National Endowment for Democracy. So here you have a perfect example of the Anti-Defamation League at the center of a drug-running, corrupt operation that was involved in pushing the Contras as the great heroes of democracy. Now let me go quickly to this question of Milken, because once again you see the footprints of the ADL all over the place. What Michael Milken did was figure out how to go from the street thugs of Lansky up through the Sterling National Bank crowd, the banking crowd that was involved in the garment district and casinos eventually and certain other things, into the boardrooms of Wall Street. That's the role Milken played. And that's why Milken was defended all the way by these ADL lawyers. Because what Milken did is he offered them the way in which they could take the money they had made from prohibition and then from drugs and turn it into leverage to buy up the United States. Look at who were called Milken's monsters. Now, this term, Milken's monsters, is the term used by one of them, Meshulam Riklis, who's known in Israel as Meshuggah Riklis, because he's a crazy guy. Riklis is one of these thugs who was kicked out of Israel on several points for trying to defraud people there. Riklis took over an insurance company and then came to Milken with a plan. If you fund me, I can take other companies and get you money back. And Riklis was joined by other people, such as Carl Lindner, who took over United Fruit Company. United Fruit Company has been investigated for years by the Drug Enforcement Agency for bringing cocaine up from Latin America. With Lindner on the board of United Fruit Company is Max Fisher, formerly of the Purple Gang, the Detroit gangsters, close friend of Henry A. Kissinger, the man who convinced Ronald Reagan to bring George Bush in as vice president in 1980 in Detroit at the Republican National Convention. They're Lindner, Victor Posner, the guy who took over Lansky's real estate empire, and a whole group of these guys. And Milken figured out how to use junk bonds to finance these guys to take over major corporations. That is, they could start mixing billions of dollars, illegal drug money, prostitution operation money, all kinds of dirty money, through junk bonds to create the capability for leverage buyouts. All illegal. And when Michael Milken was finally stopped, when they finally arrested him and allowed him to plea bargain so he served less than 2 years in jail, the lawyer Alan Dershowitz stood up and said the attack on Michael Milken is done by a cabal of anti-Semites. This is the same charge that the ADL, or the Publicity Committee of B'nai B'rith, said to protect the Jewish gangsters on the Lower East Side in 1910. That if you call them gangsters, you're really just anti-Semitic. And in the late 1980s, when Milken was going on trial, the same gang who run a protection operation, who protected organized crime, immorality, and filth for 100 years, the same gang came out and said that the attack on Milken is example that anti-Semitism still exists in the United States today. Now let's look for a second at some real anti-Semites. Let's take, for example, a man named Mordecai Levy. Now, many of you may remember in February 1979, there was a big uproar because someone by the name of James Gutman applied for a permit to lead a march of Nazis through downtown Philadelphia. Now, eventually, some enterprising reporters did an investigation. You know what they turned up? James Gutman was none other than Mordecai Levy, who worked with the Anti-Defamation League and later split off that to form the terrorist Jewish Defense League. This was an operation that was run by the ADL. They wanted to have a Nazi march in Philadelphia. Why? Because how can they raise money to justify their existence if American Jews don't think there's a lot of anti-Semitism? So what better thing to do than to slap swastikas on a couple of people, lead them on a march through town, and then the next day the ADL comes marching in and says, look, there are Nazis on the streets, you need to give us money so we can protect you. And then on top of that, have a tax-exempt status. This was not a one-time operation. A similar thing happened in Trenton, New Jersey. A man named James Rosenberg, also on the payroll of the fact-finding division of the Anti-Defamation League. Under the name Jimmy Mitchell, he worked to convince a small group of people who called themselves Klansmen. He convinced them to go into Trenton and blow up the New Jersey headquarters of the NAACP. And this was also exposed. There's a long history of this. In fact, since I'm running out of time, you'll have to get the book to read it, because there's a story in here that goes back to the 1960s, when the civil rights movement was just getting off the ground, and 3 freedom fighters from the North, or freedom riders from the North, came down the Mississippi to demonstrate as part of Mississippi Summer. And they were killed. Their names were Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. And after they were killed, one of the killers, a man named Alton Wayne Roberts, was put on the payroll of the Anti-Defamation League and given more than $69,000 to work for the ADL. And one of the things that Roberts did was convince some Klansmen to go blow up the home of an ADL leader in Mississippi. And when the Klansmen went to do it, the FBI was there. They shot and killed a couple of Klansmen. And the ADL went all over the country saying, the Ku Klux Klan is out to kill ADL leaders. But it was another case where the ADL had organized the very people who were going out to do the shooting. So this organization has nothing to do with defending Jews from anti-Semitism. Or they have nothing to do with their claim occasionally to be a civil rights organization. They have sponsored racists, they have sponsored anti-Semites, and they have protected gangsters and crooks. And the worst crime of the Anti-Defamation League is that they founded and led the task force that ended up railroading Lyndon LaRouche to prison, largely because of their fear of the exposure that was being brought to them by LaRouche. LaRouche did not set out to go to war against the Anti-Defamation League. He set out to shut down international drug traffic because drugs were destroying our country, killing our children. That's why we printed the book Dope Incorporated. And isn't it interesting that the ADL saw the book Dope Incorporated and said, LaRouche is anti-Semitic. And they hired a progressive Labor Party Maoist dropout to write an article saying that whenever LaRouche talks about international bankers, he really means, quote, Jewish bankers. LaRouche never talks about Jewish bankers. We talk about bankers who commit genocide. We don't care what their religion is. If a banker adopts policies, or if someone adopts policies that kill, we will attack them. And so the ADL, rather than saying, Mr. LaRouche, what's your problem with Meyer Lansky? We think Meyer Lansky was good for the Jewish people because he got a lot of money for Jews. Instead of coming out openly to defend Lansky, or to defend Milken, or to defend these operations, they labeled LaRouche and his associates anti-Semites in the attempt to keep you from reading what we have to say, from talking to us, from voting for us. And when people started voting for LaRouche candidates, the ADL went even more berserk. The head of the fact-finding division of the ADL, Erwin Sewell, went to Sweden to try to claim that Lyndon LaRouche was responsible for the murder of Olof Palme. And who was Sewell working for when he did that? Well, recently, top-level officials from the East German secret police, the old communist Stasi, said that they were the ones who wanted to plant the story that LaRouche killed Palme, to cover up the tracks of the Soviet side. And who did the bidding of the communist dictators in Moscow and East Berlin? Erwin Sewell, of the fact-finding division of the ADL. We have to look at this because if we don't rid this menace, rid the country of this menace, disrupt the ADL, take the ADL's tax-exempt status away, expose them for what they are, they will continue their thuggish operations to try to prevent there from being an effective war on drugs. In recent months, we've seen the obscene spectacle of the Anti-Defamation League publicly attacking the role of the Nation of Islam in rooting out drugs from ghettos in Washington, D.C. A group called the Dope Busters, who don't use guns, who go in and talk to children, who go in and run the drug pushers out of the ghetto projects, were given some grants from the Housing and Urban Development Department as a project, a pilot program, to see if they could run the dope pushers out. And who is attacking the people who are attacking drugs? The ADL. And that's why we call them America's dope lobby. Now, the question has been posed by Mr. LaRouche. Do the American people have the moral fitness to survive? We're in a situation of danger of World War III. We're in a situation of economic collapse. The media is telling you there's a recovery even as you're walking down to pick up your pink slip. The media is saying that we've turned around the war on drugs even while in your neighborhood you're afraid to walk out at night because there are gangs and drug pushers on every corner, better armed than the local police. And when people try to mobilize against this, when LaRouche puts together an operation, a war on drugs, who comes to the defense of the drug pushers? The Anti-Defamation League. This is an organization of treason. It's an organization which serves as a front for organized crime. And the greatest victims of the Anti-Defamation League are those Jewish people in the United States who give money to the ADL because the ADL has convinced them that they are going to be victims of a new Holocaust in the United States unless they give money to people like Erwin Sewell so he can race over to Sweden and try and frame up Lyndon LaRouche. So the question posed by LaRouche is, do the American people have the moral fitness to survive? We're doing everything we can to answer that in the affirmative. That's why we're putting out as many hundreds of thousands of copies of this book as we can. And that's why people need to buy them in bulk. Take them out and give them to your friends, people in your church, in your synagogue. If someone in your family is going to give money to the ADL because they think the ADL is standing up for anti-Semitism, make sure they know the truth. There's enough consumer fraud in this country. So help us get this book around. Help us get this story out. The real story of the 20th century has been a story of a collapse of morality, in the latter part of this century. And at the center of it has been the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you.